Today in federal court, Donald Trump is going to face 37 counts in connection with the alleged mishandling of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago residence and the resort. The documents included in this indictment had details on the nuclear capabilities of the U.S. and foreign countries, as well as potential military vulnerabilities and plans for potential retaliation by the U.S. in response to a foreign attack, among other things. So joining us now is Ambassador John Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump. Ambassador Bolton, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for being with us today. Your long experience with classified and defense documents in the past informs you to the question I really want to know from you first is, how sensitive is the information that the former president allegedly kept, obstructed, refused to return, potentially revealed?
Well, you can't say for certain, obviously, until you see the documents themselves. But I can tell you what we presented to the president, not just intelligence briefings, but proposed options and potential consequences for different decisions he might make. We're really at the top end of America's most sensitive secrets and information. And it stands to reason the president gets to make only the hard decisions, the decisions that his subordinates have not been able to figure out how to make, or that are uniquely within the responsibility of the president, and to try and allow the president to perform that function to the best extent possible. You give him the most important information there is. So to the extent that Donald Trump, one way or another, found a way to retain some of this information, the potential is that that this is material that in the hands of America's adversaries would do incalculable damage to the United States. This is a very serious case, and it's not financial fraud. It's not hush money to porn stars. This is the national security of the United States at stake. And I just urge everybody, read the indictment. If you think there's political bias inherent in this prosecution, read the indictment. And ask yourself, if this were a Democrat accused of these things, would you think this didn't warrant prosecution? I think we've got to take the politics out of this business when national security is at stake. And this is a good place to start.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up, because you were in the room where it happened, that Oval Office, or on the road with him, or in the down in the Situation Room. Is there a process at the end of the day, let's say, for him to declassify things? Is there a written process or a record, or can he just do it? I don't mean through mental telepathy. That doesn't happen, we know. But is there a procedure and records kept to track what is declassified, what is not declassified?
Well, there should be, and in most cases there is. But to be clear, and I do think there's a lack of clarity on this point, there are no restrictions on the president what he can declassify. So when people talk about a process, the only process that matters is post-decisional. And the president has to make manifest the decision to declassify documents. And when he does, he can do it in a variety of ways. There are no magic federal forms, no magic words. He can do it in a variety of ways. And then the rest of the government knows that he's declassified something. So the idea that he had a standing order declassifying anything he took from the Oval Office to his residence is complete nonsense. It's not true, and it wouldn't make any sense. It reveals Donald Trump's unique fascination with himself. He thinks, if I take a piece of paper to the residence, I declassify it, and I can do it on my own without telling anybody, perhaps not understanding that there may be dozens of copies of that document electronically, in hard copy, all around the government. The information contained in the document, which is really what's classified, is in many different places around the government. You can't declassify one piece of paper without declassifying the rest of the information. That requires making a decision to declassify manifest, which he has not done. I think this idea, his version of what his authority was made up entirely after the fact, when he recognized he had been caught in a very difficult situation given the documents at Mar-a-Lago.
By the way, The Room Where It Happened would be a very good title for a book. I'm not sure if you considered that. Let me ask you.
Call my publisher.
One more question about declassification. One of the documents, according to the indictment, talks about nuclear programs. It contains nuclear secrets. Does the president have sole authority to declassify that? Does the Atomic Energy Act come into play there, where he actually can't do it alone?
Well, I think constitutional authority rests with the president. Article 2, Section 1 says the executive authority shall be vested in the president of the United States, and no congressional statute can limit that.
So I'm wondering, when you look at these kinds of documents, and you would know more or have a better idea than almost anybody what might be in them from the brief descriptions that are in the indictment, but when you talk about the potential for incalculable damage, I wonder, Donald Trump has been underestimated so many times before, and predictions of his demise when he faced political or legal or almost any kind of challenge have largely been overstated. Do you think that this time will be different?
Well, I think that largely depends on the scheduling of the case, and your previous guest was discussing that. The government has said it wants a speedy trial. I think people should ask themselves, and pro-Donald Trump or anti-Donald Trump, what would an innocent person do confronted with this indictment? I think that person would say, I want an immediate trial. I want to clear this stain from my reputation, remove this cloud over my head. This is made up. I don't want delay. I'm not going to file all kinds of procedural motions. I want trial by Labor Day. That's what an innocent person would do. That's what anybody who wanted to clear his name would do. Let's see what Donald Trump does.
This indictment leaves open the question of why Donald Trump took the documents and then refused to hand them over. You've had interactions with him over classified material. Do you have an idea of why he might have wanted to keep some of these documents? And also, do you have an idea of what in particular interested him when he was in the Oval Office?
Well, I'm not a shrink, so I can't really read motives. And I would stress fundamentally the reason why he kept them is not relevant. The fact is, whatever the reason, he put these documents in jeopardy. It might be worse if Russia or China had actually picked them up. But the crime here, the crime for him and every official of the executive branch that deals with classified information, is not to mishandle them in a way that puts that at risk. But why did he keep the documents? Because he liked to say, I've got it and you don't. Because he thought it would be cool. Because it just struck his fancy on any given day. Did he have more malign motives, selling information to foreign governments, using it for blackmail or extortion? It's possible. It wouldn't be out of character. But I don't think we know that based on the information that's available. Perhaps it will come out at trial. But again, I would just stress it really doesn't matter why he kept it. He shouldn't have done it. And any subordinate in the executive branch who did it would already be in the slammer.
Knowing him the way you do, and I'll reference your book again, In the Room Where It Happened, because you were very critical of the former president's approach to foreign policy. But did you imagine this?
Well, he clearly liked to keep things, and it was part of, for example, at the intelligence briefings when they happened, every fourth day, every fourth working day or whatever it was, to make sure that we left the room with whatever the intelligence briefers had come in with, or when we were in the Situation Room discussing matters that get discussed there, to make sure, frankly, that nobody walked out with documents that they hadn't themselves brought to the meeting. So I don't know exactly how a lot of this came into his possession. It's very disturbing. I think that is something that for general security for all presidents, we should be more careful about. And that's something that goes to leaving at the end of a president's term, but also records management during the course of the term.
Now, some of the presidential candidates running against him, Chris Christie, notably Asa Hutchinson, but now even Nikki Haley in part, are criticizing. But let's listen to what the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, of course, second in line for the presidency, had to say.
What about those pictures? Was that a good look for the former president to have boxes in a bathroom? I don't know, is it a good picture to have boxes in a garage that opens up all the time? A bathroom door locked. So look, I don't want people to take these documents away.
What's your reaction to him saying, well, the bathroom door is locked?
Look, this is serious business. And the fact that others may have done things that endanger the security of documents doesn't excuse Donald Trump. You know, a lot of Republicans today are making the argument there's a double standard, that Trump is being treated differently than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or fill in the blank. Let's assume there is a double standard. Do you resolve that problem by defaulting to no standard at all because you believe Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden have escaped free of charges? You give Donald Trump a break, too? I think the answer is no. I think you prosecute crimes when you see them, and the way to avoid the double standard is to have a high standard and prosecute regardless of politics. It's not to try and explain away Donald Trump because bad decisions were made with respect to others.
I'll add that Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel to investigate President Biden's handling of classified documents, and that investigation is still ongoing. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you very much. But go ahead. You want to add one more thing? You can.
Please.
For what it's worth, I don't like special counsels. I don't like the institution. I didn't like it when they were statutory. I don't like them today. I think we should trust our officials to honor their obligations and to meet their oath and not presume they're going to do something that we consider a conflict of interest.
Former National Security Advisor and Ambassador John Bolton, thank you very much for joining us.